Hello. So you want to be a CFO. What does it take? What do you need to know? Where do you start the journey? And once you're in the C-suite, how do you bring the right mix of skills and passions to the table to make the right kind of impact? The answers are coming up. Welcome, I'm Kyle Hannon. I'm based in the AICPA and CIMA office in London. This is the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of AICPA and CIMA. Every week, we share insights from inside the accounting and finance profession that help you stay ahead of the curve, whatever business you're in. My guest is on the board of no less than 4 stock exchange registered corporations. She's also a board member for an influential non-profit, and she is Eileen Kamerick. She's also a National Association of Corporate Directors Board Leadership Fellow and a SEC financial expert, and has held corporate senior advisor and CFO roles for major multinational companies with businesses in Asia, the EU, Africa, and the Americas. And they've included Amoco Corporation, Heidrick & Struggles, and Leo Burnett. Eileen will also be a speaker at the forthcoming AICPA Engage 2020 conference coming up in July, which is why she joins us now with her insights on what those aspiring to become a CFO need now and in the future. Eileen, welcome. Where are you joining us from?
Well, I'm joining you from a barrier island off Florida, Longboat Key, and as I look out my window, in fact, as you were speaking, Kyle, I saw some dolphins going by. So we're in quarantine, but I can't complain.
I can certainly understand why you wouldn't want to. I feel almost bad dragging you away from the view from your window and asking you for your view on boards and CFOs, but that is something you're an expert in, so it's a shame to waste the opportunity. I did mention you're a board member of corporations on the New York Stock Exchange. You're also on the board of a non-profit. And that sounds like a fascinating combination. So here's where I think I'd like to start. Are there questions that you're asked, or there's things that typically people want to know from you once they learn that you're a board member?
Well, sometimes they ask sort of what do boards do and how did you get that role and things like that. And just to unpack those two questions, I try to simplify what are the key objectives or what are the challenges that boards take on. There are really 3 things. There's succession, strategy, and performance management. There are a number of sort of administrative or regulatory or compliance areas that boards are responsible for. But if you think about what's really important to a board, it's managing performance on behalf of the shareholders. And I tell people, remember, you're elected by the shareholders and you work for the shareholders. Yeah. They're focused on succession, certainly of the CEO, but also of the other C-suite executives. And then strategy. Now, that's a responsibility that's owned by both the C-suite, particularly the CEO, and the board. But you have to remember that you've got to make time for focusing on looking forward, having that field vision to sort of, as I say, look down the field and not just be looking backwards, which is a challenge for people who are trained as financial people and as accountants, because again, you're always looking at the quarterly reports and those are history. But what you want to do is use that history to say, how should that influence my decisions going forward? So I think those are the 3 things that boards really do and that they need to use as touchstones to remember what their key objectives are and what their role is. And then people ask me, well, how did you make that transition from being a CFO to being on boards? And there's actually some fairly practical tips about that. I was the CFO of a company, Leo Burnett, that was being bought by Publicis, and we were in the middle of regulatory oversight and review, and it was taking quite a while. And I saw something at a local university that was focused on getting people ready to serve on boards. And I said, this is something that at some point in my career, I see the opportunity to take what I have learned and help others, particularly CFOs, because I'm often chair of the audit committee. And I think part of that role, apart from being independent and challenging of the CFO and the finance team, is also being a mentor to CFOs. And I've always enjoyed that role as a CFO in terms of developing people who worked for me. And I saw that as part of the role as a board member. And so I attended that session regarding getting ready for a boardroom. And then, frankly, I took very practical steps in terms of taking training, being involved in something called National Association of Corporate Directors, being involved with women corporate directors. And just very basically letting people know that I thought I would be a good director, and these are the kind of companies that I would like to serve on as a director. I call that, for lack of a better term, the elevator pitch. But you have to be ready to answer the question of what do you think you would be good at, and what do you think you would add to a board of directors? Now, with the CFO role, some of that is logical because you say, well, I could serve on the audit committee. But they don't just want technicians on the audit committee. They want someone who can add value in terms of strategy, who can participate as a full partner with the management team and other executives. And so over the next 15 years or so, I built my profile through speaking engagements, through being trained myself, by volunteering for things, to create the kind of profile that was attractive in terms of people who were looking for executives to serve on boards.
So you mentioned accountants, you mentioned that 15-year journey of yours. Take us back in time a little bit to where that journey may start. What is the typical pathway from starting in the profession, perhaps as an accountant or a finance professional, to finally perhaps getting that CFO role?
Sure. I mean, there are a number of different steps, and to be entirely transparent, I did not come up through the chartered accountant or public accountant role that most people do to get the CFO job. I actually began my career as a lawyer. I was an M&A lawyer at Skadden Arps, and then I was recruited to Amoco, a large oil company which later merged with BP. To work as an international lawyer. And I was so taken by what I call the kind of romance of business. I mean, it's so exciting. You're creating value. You're working with other people. I was flying around the world doing joint ventures and acquisitions and financings and divestitures that I thought, I want to know more about this world. So I went back and I went to University of Chicago and got an MBA in finance. And then I came up through the treasury track. So I was treasurer of Amoco, working on a number of financings and, again, acquisitions, divestitures, joint ventures, and then moved from that to being CFO. But in terms of the typical track for someone who is an accountant, I mean, that track usually looks like going through, in the U.S., the chief accounting officer position, which is a very significant role. Frankly, as the CFO role has grown and broadened and almost become a sort of a mini CEO role, the chief accounting officer role has taken on more and more significance. So I think, that's a logical step as one moves through the sort of senior roles of FP&A and the accounting roles and the financial reporting roles to make that jump to the chief accounting officer role. I think what is a challenge for people, and this was true from the treasurer's role as well, is to make that jump from that to being the CFO. Because I really see that as moving from being certainly a business person and a partner, but primarily a technician in many ways. And now you are a business executive like the other C-suite executives, and you have to learn to move out of your comfort zone, frankly, and be willing to take risk in terms of the business judgment you're making, the advice that you're giving, and kind of row in the same boat with everyone else who's in the management team, who's dealing with a lot of ambiguity, and using what you've done as an accountant, i.e. creating the reports and the financial reporting and the analysis, to help make future decisions. And I think that jump is the one that's critical for people who want to be CFOs. The history is great and it's important and you have to get it right, but that's the starting point. You need to use that to be able to inform your decision making, to say, what choices will I make? What are the numbers telling me? What I always say to people is, these are just accounts. These are just numbers. What story are they telling you, and how do they drive your decision going forward? And it's making that jump to move out of, as I said, your comfort zone as an accountant, to say, how do I use these numbers, to create a narrative that is compelling in terms of driving the business forward?
I was watching a presentation you gave not too long ago, and you mentioned the need for someone at that level to be able to identify core issues and then to put their finger on opportunities that those issues may make possible. And I got a sense that there's a fair amount of interpretation of data. There's vision. There's hard-nosed business realities that you've got to factor in. It certainly seems that being a CFO involves a lot of different qualities. So as a CFO, you've seen this in reality. You've seen this on the ground. Can you tell us what organizations may be looking for in a CFO today? How's that changed compared to what they may have been looking for in a CFO a few years ago?
Well, that's a very good question. It does vary by industry, but I think there's some themes that are common themes. And so, some of this sadly comes when I hear CEOs talk about why they're disappointed in their CFO. So what are they looking for? They're certainly looking for a business partner, someone who, as I said, can use sort of their skills and analysis in looking at the numbers to make decisions and to have a point of view about what they should do next. And by the way, I think a good CEO, and I've seen this again and again, wants a point of view that is the CFO's authentic point of view, not necessarily echoing what the CEO or the other C-suite executives have to say. Just to step back from that, I think it's important for CFOs to build personal and professional credibility with their CEO, their boards, and the other C-suite executives to say that they're competent, they're reliable, they're people who always hit their mark when you need them to. But I think they're also, CEOs are looking for CFOs who have new ideas, who are willing to challenge them, to step outside of their comfort zone, and to use their expertise and broad business judgment to say, there are things that we should think about that we haven't focused on. There are opportunities that we should try to look at and perhaps de-risk and take a flyer on. Things like that, because the CEO job is a very lonely job. I mean, you're reporting to the board of directors, and certainly they can be helpful and be a sounding board. But frankly, given what CEOs make now, they're expected to have the answers. They're not expected to come to the board and say, I have door A, B, and C, and I'm not sure what to do. What do you think I should do? That's a very easy recipe for being sort of ushered out the door. And so the CEO is looking for someone to partner with them and frankly, to some extent, share that burden of, I need to have, if not all the answers, certainly the right questions to ask. And they expect their CFO to be proactive, to be connected with the business community, to be broad-based in terms of what's happening in the industry, and to come to the CEO and the other C-suite executives and say, I have ideas, I have concerns, I have ways of addressing challenges that they haven't thought of or that broaden their perspective in terms of how to address growing companies in mature economies, which is always a challenge, but particularly in the current environment with the pandemic and the real shutdown of so much of the economy. This is a new time, and CFOs can play a really critical role in terms of being hands-on, in terms of keeping the ship running and operations moving smoothly, but also looking 3 and 6 and 9 and 12 months down the road and saying, where there is a challenge, where there's crisis, there's also opportunity. What are the means by which we can make sure we take advantage of that opportunity?
Now, one of the things that we always look at is Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. Everyone's very familiar with that. But perhaps if the situation of the last few months has taught us, no matter how you look at stuff, sometimes things will happen that you cannot plan for. And this balance of short-termism versus long-term view. You talked about keeping an eye on the hard-nosed realities of the business, but also you have to bring a certain vision, a certain higher level view, an overall strategic vision to things as well. That's what happens at the C-suite. So would you say that may be where the CFO role is headed in the future? I mean, I know that talking of the future, you will be speaking about this type of topic at Engage 2020 in July. So I don't want to ask you to repeat anything that, of course, people can discover then. But generally, where would the CFO role be headed in the future? Do you think there's more space, more opportunity for vision, for passion?
Well, I think there is, but let me be clear, there's kind of a table stakes requirement as well. I mean, doing well in terms of the quarterly reports, making sure that all of the financial and compliance matters are covered off and that you're a pair of safe hands that can be relied upon to hit your mark, to be crisp on earnings calls, to not have an issue with the accounting or restatements. I mean, that's the kind of sine qua non that you must do that to be able to build credibility. The CEO is not going to be forgiving of having constant issues and sort of the day-to-day of what the accountants, the chief accounting officer, and the CFO have to get done. They expect that, and they have a right to demand it. I think it's really almost an allocation of time. I think CFOs, not unlike boards, have to make sure that they don't allow the sort of quarterly reporting and that natural cadence. I mean, everyone who's been a CFO or a chief accounting officer or worked in finance knows that feeling. As soon as you close a quarter and report it, you're right back in it again. And you can get on what I call that hamster wheel of just, I'm reporting the numbers and now I'm reporting the numbers again, without pulling your head up and looking downfield and saying, again, what are these numbers telling me? Just as an aside, I remember when I was working for a company that was about to IPO, and I asked my finance team and accounting team to look at creating what in the US is called a management discussion and analysis, which is looking at the company through the eyes of management. And what I got was this account went up and this account went down. And I said, this is accounting. This is not analysis. You need to be able to tell a story and have the numbers support that story so that it's credible and so that they are forward-looking indicators of what you should do. You know, having said that, I think the CFOs who really succeed do a couple of things. First of all, they do that first thing that I described, which is they are a pair of safe hands. They make sure that the basic, the fundamentals that CFOs and chief accounting officers have to achieve, which is getting the numbers out accurately, analyzing them effectively, communicating them effectively, is done. And then I think there are two other things. One is, I think really good CFOs are able to communicate to people who are not financial experts to make what is complicated simpler to understand and more compelling. And I can't tell you enough how valuable learning those communication skills of taking what is highly technical situations and issues as conveyed through the accounting numbers and turning them into stories and themes that people who are not financial experts can relate to, understand, and find compelling. I think that kind of communication set of skills is something that's in increasing demand. I hear it all the time from private equity and other firms that want to take a company public. They need a CFO who's financially literate and on top of things, but also can convey the story of the company in a way that is compelling to investors and to analysts. And then as you talked about the sort of vision, I think that really comes down to managing your time in a way that you carve out the time to think strategically, to learn about the business, to spend time with the business people within your company, to understand what they're seeing on the horizon in terms of risks and opportunities. As I said at the top of this conversation, I think that's always the challenge for boards. I mean, you can frankly spend all your time ticking the boxes in terms of compliance and regulation. And don't get me wrong, that has to be done. And if you don't do it, there will be dire consequences. But it's really having the discipline to say, I need to carve out the time to make sure that I'm connected with my industry, with the world at large, that I'm reading and talking to people who are thinking about how the world could change, and that bringing that back as a thought leader within the C-suite, as a CFO, and as someone, you know, on a board of directors who's thought not just about this quarter or this year, but 3 and 5 and 10 years forward.
So as you say, you've got to make a start before you can think about making a difference. And
yes.
Well, let's talk about what the typical start would be. Let's say new CFO, new in the role. What are the first 90 days going to be like for them? What are the milestones?
Well, I think in the first 90 days, it's one of two things. You've either been hired from outside, which means the most that you know is reading the public financial statements, or you've been chief accounting officer or treasurer or head of corporate development or a role like that. So you know the company, but from a very different angle. So this is a bad American football analogy, but you have to catch the ball before you start to run. And in that instance, what that means is you've got to spend your time really steeping yourself in the numbers and the business and understanding it. I make an analogy to an earnings call. You really want to know much more than anyone who's asking you questions on the earnings call. not just memorizing, but understanding the business. And on a broader framework, I think that's what the first 90 days of a CFO is. I also think a CFO should be listening more than speaking in the first 90 days and doing a kind of listening tour where they go and talk to the other stakeholders in the business, certainly the other C-suite executives, perhaps the board and investors, and have a point of view about the questions they want to ask, but be willing to listen and understand more about the business. And then I think what's critical is in that first 90 days, you'll have a set of accounts, you'll have an earnings call. I mean, frankly, that's your sort of, baptism by fire, that you want to be able to show that you've mastered the business, you have your hands around it, you understand it, you can explain it and answer questions in a compelling way. And that will take up your first 90 days. I think doing the best you can on those topics and also building a bridge to other people in the business. The CFO has, like many staff officers, a dual role. They are a partner with the other business leaders, but they're also a guardian. So they are the person who, if something goes left or right, has to say, we can't do this or we can't do it in this way. It's important for CFOs to really avoid, to the extent possible, being called Dr. No, and instead be seen as someone who is open-minded, fair, willing to listen, and has built up the professional and personal capital with other business leaders so that when the time comes when they say, we can't do what you're suggesting or we can't do it in the way that you're suggesting it, that the other executives don't think they're doing that as a power play or in some way to be contrarian, but because they really care about the business and the executive, and they want to do the right thing for the company and to move forward in the right way. I think it's very important for CFOs to build that personal credibility. It's easy to focus on being technically expert and not focus on sort of emotional intelligence and building those kind of personal relationships. And I think CFOs who do that, who spend the time to understand the concerns and offer to partner with other executives, build a level of personal and professional credibility that's a real strength. And I think that's a lot of what CEOs are looking for. They want someone who can work well with their other team, but also are willing to challenge them constructively, bring new ideas, and be a thought leader so that they can have a robust discussion about the challenges facing the business.
And while we're on that subject, do you have a sense of what boardroom talks are like right now with the challenges that businesses are facing as a result of COVID-19? I mean, how has the pandemic affected the CFO's role in the short and the long term right now?
Well, I think first of all, let me talk about boards and I'll talk about the CFO. I think the one thing that's happened is all of the meetings have gone virtual. So, okay, virtual meetings are great, but they aren't the same as being there in person. I think it's easier to hold virtual meetings when you know other people, as board members do. But it's hard to sit in a board meeting for 8 hours. It's, I think, much more difficult to sit in a virtual board meeting for 8 hours. And so because of what's going on with the crisis, this would have happened anyway. If it were a different kind of crisis, let's just say a major recession, rather than a pandemic. So we would personally, physically be in the boardroom rather than on, some sort of virtual means of speaking. What's happened is there's a new set of priorities. I mean, people were very worried about liquidity early on, worried about what they would say in terms of giving some sort of forecast to investors, and worried about the people in their business. I think, first and foremost, it was keeping people safe and understanding what policies to put in place to make sure that there was not danger to members of the employee base and make sure that you're taking care of them. So those issues rose to the top, and certainly the liquidity issue was one that CFOs took and ran with because it was absolutely in their bailiwick and something that they could address most readily. But what I've also seen is that board members have really required that because of the virtual format and because so much is changing so rapidly, that board meetings have really been streamlined, for lack of a better term. The issues that have to be addressed are put to the forefront, and there's fewer informational sessions. It's more a focus on what do we need to get done? How do we make sure that we have the materials that we need to have robust discussions, which, by the way, I think boards should be challenging themselves on that topic regardless. I mean, it's been forced by this pandemic, but I have a personal view that I think boards need to be more engaged and more actively engaged in what materials they see and what agendas are presented to them. And the touchstone for that should be to make sure that you have materials that give you enough information as a board member to have a robust and challenging discussion with management. I have a friend of mine who is CFO, or I should say CEO of a major insurance company in the US, and he was really passionate about this because he thought PowerPoint was a great tool, but it had sort of overwhelmed people in the boardroom. So from both the board member's side and the CFO side, I think thinking about, even though you can upload 2,000 pages of material, it doesn't mean you should. And instead, what you should be thinking about, because everyone's virtual and it's harder to communicate and it's harder to look at things on screen, what are 4 or 5 pages that really distill the essence of the challenges or the issues that the board is facing? And my friend who is CEO of this insurance company used to say, you should show actual to budget, year over year, risks and opportunities, and then a 4th slide that can be sort of for what you think is important or particular issues on that topic. Now, that's very doctrinaire, and perhaps that's too extreme, but I do think refocusing on what are the means by which the materials that the board receives really engender robust discussion. And the CFO and the general counsel play a leading role in that. They can send out 3,500 pages of material and overwhelm the board, or they can really focus on what are the things the board needs to know so that we can really get the value of their experience in the discussion that ensues. And so that's what I see happening with boards. They're reprioritizing based on what the issues are facing the pandemic, and also really focused on making sure they have materials that drive that kind of robust discussion. And I think the CFO can play a really critical role in that. I will tell you one story. When I was CFO of a public company, I came in and revamped the board materials in partnership with the board. I asked for a couple of board members to give me feedback on how I was changing the board deck. And one of the members of the board said, I really never understood the key metrics driving this business until you put them in front of me in terms of these slides. The touchstone is there should be one slide for each idea. You should be focused on the key metrics of the business, and you want to make sure you're giving the board the right information in the right form so they can have good discussions. So frankly, they can help you as a management team.
We're going to be talking shortly about how the aspiring CFO, someone who intends to go into that role, what they can do to prepare for that role. We'll also be talking a little bit more about what Eileen's going to be doing over the next few months, because we know that if you're the board member of 4 stock exchange listed corporations, things are not going to be calm at the moment. So how do we prep for a busier future? We'll find out in a minute. Let me just remind you that you are listening to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. My name is Kyle Hannon, and it's brought to you every week by AICPA and CIMA. You can find us at gobeyonddisruption.com. You can get the podcast absolutely free on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. You can get interviews like this. We've got more than 100 of them, and you'll find them all absolutely free at gobeyonddisruption.com. And talking about websites, don't forget to have a look at AICPAengage.com. The premier event for finance and accounting professionals is happening from Monday 20th to Friday 24th of July. It is 100% online, 150 illuminating sessions, 7 tracks, 2 keynotes. And you'll find out more at AICPAengage.com. That is why we are talking to my guest, Eileen Kamerick, who is talking about the aspiring CFO, just whetting our appetite for her presentation at Engage 2020. Eileen, let's talk about those who are aspiring to be a CFO. What can they do to prep for this kind of role?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to put yourself in a position so you're considered for the role. And what does that take? It's some of the things that I've mentioned before, which is being seen as reliable, consistent, hitting your mark, going above and beyond, doing more than is required, being seen as someone who's not just a technician. I mean, that's table stakes. That's as I said, the sine qua non, but also someone who has a broader or a deeper field vision, who can look down the field and see what is coming, and using the financial reporting as a means of interpreting what are the trends in the business and being able to articulate those. So I think there are some very practical things that people who are interested in being CFOs can do. I mean, on the one hand, one way to accelerate your career, regardless of whether or not you're an aspiring CFO or there are other positions that you want, is frankly raise your hand for projects that are messy or difficult or risky. Now, that seems like odd advice because there's certainly risk and downside to that. But I will tell you, the people that I have seen, and this includes myself, who were able to accelerate their careers did so because, again, they were willing to step out of their comfort zone and take on projects that other people didn't want to do and follow them through to completion. The man who is the CFO of Amoco, when I was a very junior finance person, said, I give Eileen a project and I know it's going to get done. Now, she may, break some glass along the way, but she usually circles back and fixes that. And I know if I have a difficult project, I can give it to her. That kind of reputation is something that comes to mind when a CEO is thinking about who should I support or promote to be CFO. So I think, again, thinking about, are there ways in which I could take on assignments that are outside of being an accountant or being the chief accounting officer that shows my business expertise and my ability to partner with other people? That's the other thing I would add, is learning how to collaborate and work effectively as a team member, I think, is something that differentiates someone as a chief accounting officer or a treasurer. And so the business people will support them as someone who will help them further their objectives, and they see them as someone who could be an effective senior executive. And then other things, I would listen to other earnings calls by other CFOs, or follow CFOs who are identified in your industry or outside your industry as being particularly effective communicators. Learn more about your own company, read the analyst reports, read industry materials, go to industry conferences, so you become an expert not on your own, just on your own company, but how your company is positioned within your industry. I think being willing to constantly learn from others and frankly, spread your wings in terms of your own skills and broadening your business expertise. All of those are things that position you well to be considered a CFO.
I think that's a great expression that you mentioned. Be known as someone who's not afraid to break glass, but also reassure people that you also bring glue. That's really important. Let's talk about how you work as a new member of an existing board, because if you come on whatever career track you have followed, your trajectory has come to the point where you are joining as a new member of an existing board. You're a CFO. What are the best ways that you can balance your impact on that board, making sure that people understand that you can break glass, but you also have glue? You have to get with the program first before you can get things moving in a different direction. So what's your advice there?
Well, certainly. I mean, it's one thing that is very different that some people adapt to well and others do not, is that being on the board is not the same as being an executive, and it's certainly not the same as being a CEO. You are not in control. You're governing, not managing, which is not to say that you shouldn't be fully engaged in what's going on in the business and ask hard questions. But I have seen CEOs in particular, if I may say, join boards and sort of feel as if it is their right to command, and that is not the role of a board member. So I think my advice in terms of joining boards is, first of all, listen and try to learn as much about the business as quickly as possible. I think onboarding is very important, and some of that is done by the company, but the individual can learn a lot from reading public reports, reading the analyst reports, listening to earnings calls, and just becoming more versed in the company and certainly in the industry, particularly if you don't come from the industry. There's basic nomenclature and just metrics and background to the industry that you need to learn. There used to be a mantra that you shouldn't say anything on a board for the first year. I really don't think that's true, and particularly because an awful lot of what the board does is accomplished in the committee meetings. There's more than ample opportunity for you to participate as you are learning. So your board work, you can really sort of make yourself be seen to shine by what you do in the committee work. And there's always opportunity for that. Typically, when you come on a board, you don't take on a chairmanship of a committee, but not always. I mean, there have been instances in which I've been recruited to boards because they needed someone immediately to take over the chairmanship of the audit committee, for example, or governance. I mean, in that instance, you can integrate yourself into the board as a committee chairman, make sure your reports are, again, crisp, compelling, cover all of the issues, and that you do a good job engaging the other committee members to make sure that you're getting their input and that their voices are heard. But let's assume that you're not a committee chair. First, you can learn the company from the bottom up, from the committee that you serve on. Audit is very good for that. Risk is as well, because you're really learning the operations, the core of the business, and the things that keep the CEO up at night on both audit and on risk. And then I'd say, finally, I think you have to learn the art on a board of being willing to ask hard questions the right way. And let me give you an example of that. I always say to people, try to sort of ask open-ended questions rather than cross-examine someone. And I can say that as a recovering lawyer. Ask, for example, tell me how you're thinking about this, as opposed to a question like, well, why did you do that? Which is sort of makes people defensive and is in some ways pejorative. So I think those open-ended questions of help me to understand, give me some background, those sort of open-ended questions allow management to explain their point of view and open up a discussion without them making them feel defensive or you to be seen to be overly judgmental. I think the other thing is the boards really have to learn how to disagree without being disagreeable, as former President Obama would say. I think everyone has to get more comfortable with debate and discussion on boards. It's a group of peers, and it certainly should be gentlemanly and gentlewomanly, but that doesn't mean that you can't ask hard, challenging questions. And that, in fact, is the most important objective of a board, to make sure that you're having robust discussions. So I think if you keep those things in mind and learn from watching other directors, particularly directors that you think are effective, you can integrate yourself effectively into a board as a new member.
I really appreciate the recalibration of the way we approach conversations, especially those open-ended questions. I was going to ask, Eileen, are you going to be busy over the next 6 months? But now I'm going to change that. I'm going to do something a little more open-ended. I'm going to say, Eileen, tell us what you'll be doing over the next 6 months.
Well, I mean, certainly being on lots of virtual board calls and doing my best to stay connected with the businesses where I serve on the board, and also having a lot of interim unscheduled calls. I think one of the things that most boards have done as a result of going virtual and not having that personal connection of having board meetings is boards are having a lot more interim calls and committee calls. And I think that's very healthy to make sure that people stay connected even though we're all virtual, and make sure that we're frankly over communicating, which is something that is critical given that it's easy to become sort of disconnected even with all the communication tools that we have. I think that level of over communication is really critical to make sure that the management team and the board stay aligned and that they are addressing all of the challenges, which I think will continue over the next 6 months. It's not clear to me that, we aren't facing another round of different challenges. We thought we were sort of coming out of the woods on the pandemic, but as you see in the US, cases are rising. And there will be unexpected and unanticipated issues that I think boards and management teams really have to challenge themselves to stay on top of and stay connected one with another to make sure that we're anticipating as best we can what the solutions would be with what we're faced with.
And you'll be speaking at Engage 2020. Can you give us a bit of a teaser on what you'll be talking about and what they can expect?
Sure. I think it's really a building out of some of the questions that you asked, Kyle. How does someone move from having been an accountant and a really good accountant and an analyst and someone who's crisp and on top of the numbers to a role that in some ways is like the CEO role? It's almost impossible in its breadth. How do you prepare yourself and how can you be effective? And I think a couple of the things that I want to talk about is getting out of your comfort zone in terms of putting out the numbers, for lack of a better term, and using that platform as a means of really looking downfield and being able to join the management team as a full business partner and think about the numbers as a means of telling a story that help you make decision going forward. And then the other thing that I'm really going to focus on is I think how critical communication skills are as a CFO. We can all get better at that. I mean, I have friends of mine who are CEOs and CFOs who are considered masters in terms of investor relations, the way they speak to regulators, their shareholders, and to analysts. And yet they constantly challenge themselves to be trained or to hone their skills in terms of doing that. And I know that seems like a soft skill, but I think it's a soft skill that's overlooked by a lot of people who are aspiring CFOs, because frankly, so few people do it well that you can differentiate yourself as an aspiring CFO as someone who communicates with non-financial people in a way that they understand and can resonate to. And I think developing that, which there are very specific steps in which you could do that, really can make you stand out in the crowd in a way that I'm not sure that accountants and aspiring CFOs recognize. So those are kind of the major themes. And I think also the theme of being both a partner and a guardian, someone who can partner with the business team and build personal credibility with them as a means of enhancing your chances of becoming CFO.
Looking forward to it. Now, where can people find out more about the work you do or more about you? Is it LinkedIn? Do you have a website that, let's say someone's listening to this 6 months after Engage, they're trawling through our archive and they want to find out more about Eileen Kamerick. Where would they go to find out more?
Well, probably my LinkedIn. I mean, they could join one of the law school classes or business school classes that I teach, although I think that's probably unlikely, if I may say, at Georgetown or University of Chicago or University of Iowa. But LinkedIn, really. And then I am often quoted in publications like Agenda, which is read by most members of the board of directors. And also publications like Directors and Boards, things like that. Okay,
and we'll have links to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes to this episode. Finally, Eileen, we ask all our guests the same question. If you were to create a Go Beyond Disruption podcast t-shirt that contained a single insight, a single piece of advice around the topic that we've spoken about today, what would you print on the front of that t-shirt?
Well, it might have to be a very large t-shirt, so let me try to summarize this as best I can. I think really don't be afraid to ask hard questions and take on risky or difficult projects, and find ways to partner with other people to help them meet their objectives and achieve their dreams. I think if you think of those two things, that you will, one, be a happier CFO or potential CFO, and two, you will have really made your mark as someone who is admired as a business person and as a business partner who really makes a difference.
Eileen Kamerick, thank you very much for talking to us at the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. You can find out more about Eileen by following the notes here in the podcast show notes. And of course, by going to AICPAengage.com, have a look for Eileen's session that is running online from July 20th to Friday, July 24th. My guest, Eileen Kamerick, much appreciated. And of course, much appreciated to all of you listening around the world. We will be back with more insights that will help you and your business to go beyond disruption. Till our next episode, keep listening and keep safe. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.